The workshop had been locked for decades. So why did Koda recognize the one wall that wasn't supposed to hide anything? Koda froze at the rear wall, ears forward. Scrape, scrape. Cold air slipped through the dusty baseboard as Luke's flashlight shook across the plywood. Then the German shepherd pressed his nose to one exact spot and scratched once. Something was behind there, and Koda seemed to remember it. What do you think Koda knows? Luke Mercer had been awake since 3:17 that morning. Not because of a nightmare. Those were easier to identify. This time it had been the heating pipe in the wall of his rented apartment. Metal contracting in the Montana cold. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then another. Luke had opened his eyes before the 4th. For several seconds he lay perfectly still, listening. His right hand had already moved toward the edge of the mattress. Then Koda lifted his head from the rug. The German shepherd looked at Luke, gave a slow exhale through his nose, and lowered his muzzle between his paws again. No threat. Luke checked the clock. 3:17. He never went back to sleep. By 9, he was sitting inside Mara Bennett's law office in Missoula, wearing the only dark jacket he owned and wishing he'd chosen the chair closer to the window. Instead, he had taken the one facing the door. Habit. At 43, Luke had learned there were habits worth correcting and habits that weren't worth fighting anymore. He knew where the exits were. He noticed who entered a room. He noticed hands. He noticed vehicles parked too long. Most people called that being observant. Luke didn't call it anything. Across the conference table, Scott Mercer checked his watch for the 3rd time. Scott was Walter's nephew, though he'd spent most of the last decade acting as if the old man were an embarrassing piece of family history. His charcoal suit fit too well for Timber Hollow, and the silver watch on his wrist probably cost more than Luke's truck. Beside him sat his wife, Emily. She offered Luke a careful smile. "I'm sorry about Walter." Luke nodded. "Thank you." That was enough. Walter Mercer had been his great-uncle, a broad-shouldered machinist who smelled of cutting oil, coffee, and pine smoke. Luke had seen him perhaps 6 times in the past 10 years. Not enough. There were always reasons. Deployments first, then jobs, then distance, then the strange exhaustion that came with returning home and discovering that ordinary life could somehow require more energy than war. Walter had never complained. His last Christmas card to Luke contained 6 words. "Still here. Doors open when you're ready." Luke had kept it in a kitchen drawer. He had never gone. A paralegal entered carrying a metal document tray. Her heel caught the edge of the rug. The tray hit the hardwood floor. Crack! Luke's hand disappeared beneath his jacket. His chair scraped backward. His eyes had already found the doorway. Nobody spoke. The paralegal stared at him. Luke slowly brought his empty hand back onto the table. "Sorry." "It's okay," she said. She bent to collect the papers. Luke helped with none of them. His fingers had gone numb. For half a heartbeat, the polished conference table had disappeared. He had smelled hot dust instead of coffee, seen hard white sunlight flashing against a windshield, heard Danny Reeves shouting something from the far side of a disabled vehicle while somebody yelled for the route to be cleared. Then Missoula returned. Carpet, glass, Scott watching him. Luke picked up his coffee. The cup barely moved, but the surface inside trembled. He set it down without drinking. Mara Bennett entered a minute later. She was in her late 40s, with reading glasses hanging from a cord and a thick file tucked beneath one arm. "I'm sorry to keep everyone waiting." She sat. Luke listened as Walter's life became paragraphs. A savings account went to Walter's sister. Investment holdings were divided among 3 relatives. A small rental property near Hamilton went to Scott. Walter's truck went to Hank Dalton, an old friend Luke vaguely remembered. Tools specifically listed in an attached inventory went to several people. Then Mara turned a page, Luke hadn't expected his name at all. To Luke James Mercer, I leave the real property located beyond Black Pine Road outside Timber Hollow, consisting of approximately 5 acres, together with the machine workshop, attached office, outbuildings, and contents not otherwise specifically assigned. Scott leaned back. A short breath escaped him, almost a laugh. Luke looked over. Scott raised both hands. Sorry. He shook his head. Uncle Walt really did have a sense of humor. Emily touched his arm. Scott. What? That place is practically a scrapyard. Mara continued as though nobody had spoken. The latest appraisal places the property at approximately $31,000. Luke looked at her. That's all? That's the current estimate. Scott smiled. Before repairs. Mara closed one folder and opened another. The roof has deferred maintenance. The electrical system requires inspection. Winter access is difficult, and portions of the property haven't been evaluated recently. Scott looked at Luke. Congratulations. Walter finally found somebody desperate enough to inherit the junk pile. Emily's eyes dropped. Luke didn't answer. He had spent enough years around men who used words to see whether they could move you. The easiest answer was usually not to move. Mara's expression hardened. We're going to keep this civil. Luke looked down at the property photograph clipped to the appraisal. A long corrugated steel building sat beneath dark pines. Snow covered half the roof. Rusted machinery stood outside like animal bones. $31,000. He thought about the transmission slipping in his truck. The 2 invoices still sitting unopened on his kitchen counter. The construction job that had ended 3 weeks earlier when the contractor lost financing. Walter had apparently left him another thing that needed money. Maybe Scott was right. That thought hurt more than the joke. Mara finished the formal reading and slid several documents toward Luke. These acknowledge receipt. They don't obligate you to keep the property. Luke signed. Scott stood immediately. Emily gathered her purse. Luke remained seated. Mara waited until the others had reached the hallway. Mr. Mercer. Luke looked up. There's one more thing. She opened the desk drawer. What she removed wasn't paperwork. It was a key. Old brass. Long stem. Heavy enough that it made a small sound when she placed it on the table. Luke stared at it. This wasn't part of the formal will, Mara said. Walter left instructions that I give it directly to you. What's it open? I assume the workshop. You assume? Mara pushed a small folded piece of paper across the table. He was specific that I wasn't to explain it. Luke unfolded it. The handwriting was Walter's. Block letters. Heavy pressure. Don't sell until the dog has walked the place. Luke read it twice. Mara watched him. Do you have a dog? Yeah. What kind? German Shepherd. Something changed in her face. Not recognition exactly. Interest. Did Walter know him? Luke folded the note. Once. At least Luke thought it had been once. 3 years earlier, Walter had stopped at Luke's place outside Helena. Danny had still been alive then. He and Koda had been passing through after a search and rescue training weekend. Walter stayed for coffee. Koda had spent most of the visit beneath the table. That was it. Luke slipped the key into his jacket pocket. It felt strangely heavy. Outside, October cold had sharpened the air. Koda was sitting behind the steering wheel of Luke's aging Ford, exactly where Luke had told him not to sit. Luke opened the driver's door. Move! Koda looked at him. His left ear, damaged years before Luke inherited him, leaned slightly outward. You're 7 years old. You know what move means. Koda stepped reluctantly into the passenger seat. Luke climbed in, but didn't start the engine. For a while, he watched people leave the building. Scott and Emily crossed the parking lot toward a dark pickup. Scott glanced back once. Luke noticed. Of course he noticed. Koda nudged his elbow. Yeah. Luke pulled the brass key from his pocket. This is apparently your inheritance, too. He held it toward the dog. Koda sniffed once, then again. His body changed. It was subtle. His mouth closed. The easy panting stopped. His ears came forward. Luke frowned. Koda? The shepherd sniffed the key a third time, longer now. Then he lifted his head. Not toward Luke. Not toward the lawyer's office. Toward the northern mountains, visible beyond the rooftops. He stared. Luke looked from the dog to the key. A cold little question settled somewhere beneath his ribs. Walter Mercer had met Koda once. At least that was what Luke had always believed. Luke was still looking at the dog when a shadow crossed the windshield. Scott stood beside the truck. Luke slipped Walter's key into his pocket and lowered the window. Got a minute? Luke glanced past him. Emily waited near their dark pickup, arms folded against the cold. Depends. Scott rested one hand on the doorframe. I've been thinking about that property. You've had about 10 minutes. Scott smiled as though Luke had made a joke. Exactly. And I've got an idea that could save both of us trouble. That workshop needs money. Roof, wiring, probably foundation work. God knows what's buried around an old machine shop. Luke said nothing. I'll give you $40,000. Luke looked at him. The appraisal was 31. I know. So why 40? Scott's smile stayed in place, but something behind it tightened. Because we're family. Koda shifted in the passenger seat. Not a growl, just movement. Scott's eyes flicked toward him. Luke noticed that too. You laughed when I inherited it. I laughed because Walter stuck you with a mess. Doesn't mean I want to see you buried under it. That's generous. Scott seemed unsure whether Luke meant it. I can have Mara handle everything. You walk away with cash. No repairs, no taxes, no winter road to maintain. Luke rubbed his thumb over the seam of the steering wheel. In Afghanistan, he had learned that anomalies mattered more than explanations. A motorcycle parked where motorcycles never parked. A window open in a building where every other window was closed. A road suddenly empty at the wrong hour. Nothing meant anything by itself, until several small things began pointing in the same direction. A worthless workshop, a mocking relative, an immediate offer, $9,000 above appraisal. Luke looked at Scott. I'll think about it. Scott's jaw moved once. Don't think too long. That offer's because I'm trying to help. I heard you. Luke raised the window. Scott stepped back. Koda watched him until he crossed the parking lot. Then the dog looked north again. You're making this weird, Luke murmured. Koda gave him no argument. 2 days later, Scott called. Luke was underneath a skid steer in a repair yard outside Helena, replacing a hydraulic line for a contractor who paid cash and never asked why Luke preferred working alone. His phone vibrated against the concrete. Scott! Luke almost ignored it, then answered. Yeah, I talked to Emily. Luke tightened the fitting. Congratulations, we can do 55. The wrench stopped. 55 what? 1,000. For Walter's place. Luke slid out from beneath the machine. The afternoon sun was bright enough to make him squint. You added $15,000 in 2 days. I checked comparable land. Then send me the comparables. Silence. Only half a second. Enough. I don't have them in front of me. Then why 55? Scott sighed. Luke, I'm trying to make this simple. It was simple at 40. Things change. Luke looked at the grease across his knuckles. Apparently. He ended the call. That evening, Emily tried a different approach. She called while Luke was packing his truck. Food, sleeping bag, cold weather gear, chains, tools, first aid kit, 2 flashlights, spare batteries, water. Koda watched each item disappear beneath the camper shell. Luke, Emily said. Scott can be pushy. That's one word. I don't want this becoming some family fight. Luke wedged a tool case behind the driver's seat. Then tell him to stop bidding on something he says is worthless. A pause. It's not about the property. No? It's about you. Luke stopped. Emily softened her voice. You've been bouncing between jobs. You move every year or two. You're still driving that truck Danny helped you rebuild. Maybe what you need right now is stability, not another broken thing to fix. Luke looked through the open passenger door. Koda was sitting there. Danny's old dog. Danny's old truck project. Now Walter's old workshop. Broken things. Luke understood what Emily intended. She wanted the words to sound compassionate. Instead, they landed somewhere harder. 55,000 is a good start, she continued. You could rent somewhere decent. Take some time. Figure out what comes next. Luke closed the tool case. What comes next is Montana. What? I'm leaving tomorrow. For the workshop? That's what Walter gave me. Luke, wait. Good night, Emily. He hung up. Before sunrise, he and Koda were heading north. The mountains rose gradually beyond the windshield, first blue shadows, then dark walls edged with snow. Koda slept curled against the passenger door. Luke drove with coffee between his knees and Walter's key in the center console. Every few miles, his eyes moved to the mirrors. Nothing unusual. By evening, weather forced him off the road. A roadside motel outside Seeley Lake had 8 rooms, a flickering vacancy sign, and a parking lot rimmed with dirty snow. Luke requested a ground-floor room. The clerk offered number 6. Luke looked toward the hallway. Anything closer to an exit? The clerk blinked. 2. I'll take 2. He checked the window latch before removing his jacket. Then the bathroom. Then the connecting door. Locked. Koda waited without impatience. Clear, Luke said quietly. The word came out before he thought about it. He fed Koda, ate half a sandwich, and lay on top of the blankets fully dressed. Sleep didn't come. At 12:43 he checked the clock. At 1:26 again. Sometime after 2, exhaustion finally pulled him under. White light exploded across the curtains. Luke hit the floor. No thought. No decision. 1 second he was asleep. The next his shoulder struck carpet, his hand gripping Koda's harness. His heart hammered against his ribs. Light moved across the wall, engine noise, heavy, approaching. For several seconds the motel disappeared. He saw dust blowing across a road outside Kandahar. A vehicle sitting wrong on its suspension. Danny's hand raised. Stop! 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 Koda pushed hard against Luke. Warm body. Fur. Weight. Luke blinked. A snowplow rolled past the motel window. Its amber beacon swept across the curtains again. Luke released Koda's harness. His fingers hurt from gripping it. Sorry, buddy. Koda didn't move away. He leaned harder into Luke's shoulder. Luke sat on the floor until the plow disappeared. His breathing slowed. The dog remained against him. Just a truck, Luke whispered. Koda licked his wrist once. Luke gave a tired laugh. Yeah, I know. He slept no more that night. At first light, he loaded the truck. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs. Koda jumped into the passenger seat while Luke secured the tailgate. Then Luke stopped. Across the highway, beside a closed diner, sat a dark pickup. Engine running, windows tinted. He had seen hundreds like it. Nothing unusual, except for a pale scrape above the rear wheel. Luke had noticed the same scrape in Mara Bennett's parking lot. The truck Scott and Emily had driven away in had been dark too, but this wasn't theirs. Different body style. This one had been parked 2 rows behind it. Luke stared across the highway. The pickup didn't move. He opened his door. Koda was no longer sitting comfortably. The shepherd had turned toward the diner, mouth closed, ears forward, watching. Luke climbed behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. He waited. 30 seconds. A minute. The pickup pulled onto the highway. It didn't head south. It went north, toward Timber Hollow. Luke watched until it disappeared around the bend. Then he looked at Koda. All right. He started the engine. Now we're both paying attention. Koda remained turned toward the highway until the dark pickup disappeared around the bend. Luke waited another 30 seconds before pulling out. He didn't chase it. That was another habit he had carried home. When something looked wrong, moving faster wasn't always the answer. Sometimes you let distance open. Sometimes you watched what happened when the other person thought you weren't watching. 20 miles north, Luke stopped for fuel. No dark pickup. He bought coffee and a paper map because the woman behind the counter warned him that service disappeared beyond Timber Hollow. Black Pine Road? She asked when he mentioned Walter's property. That's the one. She looked through the window at the clouds pressing against the mountains. You've got chains? Yeah. Use them before you think you need them. Luke nodded. That sounded like good advice for more than snow. By noon, pavement had narrowed to cracked county road. Houses became farther apart. Pine and fir crowded closer to the shoulders, their branches carrying fresh snow. Koda sat upright now. The dog watched through the windshield with an attention Luke hadn't seen that morning. You know something I don't? Koda's damaged left ear twitched. Timber Hollow appeared almost without warning. An old gas station with plywood over one window, a post office, a diner, 6 or 7 houses scattered beneath the trees. Beyond them stood the remains of a lumber mill, its conveyor structure rusting beneath the mountain. Luke slowed. A weathered sign pointed toward Black Pine Road. The road climbed immediately. Within 3 miles, packed snow turned to ice. Luke pulled onto a wide shoulder and installed the chains. Koda jumped out while he worked, nose moving through the cold air. Stay close. The shepherd wandered 20 feet, stopped beside an old cedar stump, then returned without being called. Luke tightened the last chain. Good choice. The road worsened. He kept the truck in low gear and avoided sudden steering corrections. A steep drainage dropped away on the passenger side, hidden in places by snow-covered brush. 7 miles in, a lodgepole pine had fallen across half the road. Luke stopped. Before getting out, he checked his mirrors. Empty. He scanned the tree line. Nothing. Still, he left the truck angled toward open road instead of pulling nose first against the fallen tree. Koda waited inside while Luke used a folding saw to remove 2 branches. The work warmed him. Cut. Clear. Check. Move. Simple. He liked simple. The second obstruction came 4 miles later, where wind had dropped several branches across a narrow bend. By then, there were no tire tracks ahead, except an older set partly filled by snow. Luke crouched beside them. Pickup tires. Could have belonged to anyone. He looked at the tread long enough to remember its pattern, then stood. Koda watched from the cab. Yeah, Luke said. I know. Near 3 in the afternoon, the trees opened. The workshop stood at the far end of a clearing. Luke stopped the truck. For several seconds, neither he nor Koda moved. Walter's property looked worse than the appraisal photograph. The building was long and low, corrugated steel over timber framing, with rust running beneath several roof fasteners. One gutter had torn loose and hung at an angle. A loading shed leaned away from the main structure as if exhausted from holding itself upright. 2 pieces of logging machinery sat half buried in snow. An old fuel tank stood near the tree line. Behind the workshop, the land rose sharply into dark timber. No neighboring houses, no visible power lines, no sound except the ticking engine. Luke looked at Koda. $31,000. Koda sneezed. Exactly. Luke didn't drive straight to the door. He parked 30 yards away and walked the property first. Koda followed. Luke checked the windows, rear access, roofline, outbuildings. He found an old propane cage, a dry drainage ditch, and a narrow track disappearing into the trees behind the equipment shed. Near the north wall, he stopped. Tire impressions lay beneath a thin layer of newer snow. Someone had driven around the building recently. Luke crouched. He brushed loose snow from one track, too degraded to identify. Nearby, several boot impressions crossed toward the workshop, but their edges had softened. Days old, maybe longer. He straightened and studied the tree line. Koda did the same. Nothing moved. Could have been an appraiser. The dog looked at him, or not. Luke returned to the main entrance. The brass key resisted at first. He worked it gently rather than forcing it. On the 3rd turn, the lock opened. The steel door dragged across the threshold with a long groan. Cold air rolled out. Luke smelled machine oil, old wood, dust, something faintly metallic. He raised his flashlight. A workbench stretched along the left wall. Heavy equipment occupied the center floor beneath canvas covers. Pegboards held tools outlined in faded marker. Shelves disappeared into shadow. Walter hadn't left chaos. He had left a workplace. Stay. Koda waited at the threshold. Luke entered alone. He checked the office. Empty. Bathroom. Empty. Storage corner. Empty. He returned to the entrance. Okay. Koda crossed the threshold. Luke expected him to investigate everything. The old machines, oil smells, rodent trails, Walter's coat hanging from a nail. Instead, Koda moved straight through the center aisle. Luke's flashlight followed him. Koda. The shepherd continued toward the rear. He reached a plywood-covered wall behind several storage shelves, stopped, sniffed along the bottom edge, then raised his head. His damaged ear angled forward. Luke walked closer. What is it? Koda tilted his head, listening. Luke listened too. Nothing. He checked the plywood. Solid. The exterior on the other side backed toward the rising hillside. There shouldn't have been anything interesting there. Koda sniffed again. Luke touched his collar. Come on. The dog resisted for half a second, then obeyed. They spent the remaining daylight getting the attached office warm enough to sleep in. The generator took 40 minutes to start. Luke cleaned the fuel line, checked the oil, and found corrosion on one battery terminal. When the engine finally caught, yellow light flickered through the workshop. Something inside Luke loosened. A broken machine had presented a problem. He had solved it. No hidden meaning required. The office stove worked after he cleared the flue. By 7, canned stew was warming in a small pot. Koda ate beside the desk. Luke unfolded his sleeping bag on an old cot. Outside, snow began falling again. He checked the doors twice, then a third time. At 10:08, he shut off the lamp. At 11:36, he was still awake. Koda had moved from the office. Luke could see his silhouette through the open doorway. The dog was sitting in the workshop, facing the rear wall. Koda. The shepherd looked back. Bed. Koda returned. At 12:51, Luke woke and found him gone again. Same place, same wall. Luke brought him back. At 2:17, Luke opened his eyes. Koda stood over the cot, rigid. Luke didn't speak. Then he heard it. Scrape. A pause. Scrape. Metal against something hard. His body locked. The office disappeared for half a second. Hot air. Dust. The underside of a damaged vehicle. A harsh dragging sound beneath steel. Danny's voice somewhere beyond it. Luke blinked. Snow tapped against the workshop roof. Koda was already moving. Luke grabbed the flashlight and followed. The dog went directly to the rear wall. Scrape. Koda scratched once at the baseboard. Easy. Luke crouched beside him. The beam crossed old plywood, screws, dust. Nothing. Then Koda breathed against the narrow seam where the wall met the concrete floor. A gray thread of dust shifted. Luke frowned. He held his hand near the gap. Cold air touched his fingers. Not much, but unmistakable. He moved his hand several inches. Nothing. Back to the seam. Cold air. Luke slowly raised the flashlight toward the plywood wall. According to the exterior of the building, there should have been earth and framing behind it. No open space, no draft. Yet something behind Walter Mercer's wall was breathing cold air into the workshop, and Koda had known exactly where to find it. Luke stayed crouched beside the baseboard. He moved his palm across the seam again. Cold. Then nothing. Then cold again. A narrow current, steady enough to rule out imagination. Koda pushed his nose toward the gap. Luke caught his collar. Not tonight. The shepherd looked at him. We don't tear into walls at 2 a.m. because something scratches. Koda continued staring. Luke knew that look. Danny used to joke that Koda could make disagreement feel like a court proceeding. Luke stood. Morning. He expected the sound to return. It didn't. That bothered him more. By sunrise, Luke had coffee boiling and a legal pad on Walter's workbench. Instead of attacking the plywood with a pry bar, he began with the building. Outside first. 37 paces along the rear wall. Inside again. Measure. Right. Measure again. The numbers were close enough that he couldn't prove anything yet. So he stopped. There were immediate problems that mattered more. The generator coughed whenever the load increased. A section of roof flashing had lifted. Water from melting snow was freezing near the north foundation. The stovepipe needed another cleaning. Luke worked. By mid-morning, his shoulders had loosened. Measure. Cut. Fasten. Check. There was comfort in work that didn't ask how he felt. A board either fit or it didn't. A bolt was tight or loose. A generator ran or failed. Machines didn't tell you to move on. They didn't ask whether Afghanistan still woke you at night. They waited for your hands. Koda followed him from job to job. At noon, Luke found Walter's old leather work glove beneath the bench. He tossed it toward a trash pile. Koda intercepted it. That's disgusting. The dog carried it away. 20 minutes later, he was sleeping beside the stove with the glove between his front paws. Luke stared at him. You knew him. Koda opened one eye. Luke went back to work. On the third day, the generator ran clean. On the fourth, Luke sealed the roof leak. By the fifth, He had cleared enough snow from the drainage ditch that meltwater stopped pooling against the foundation. Every night, Koda returned to the rear wall, never barking, never digging wildly. He simply listened. Sometimes his nose moved along the baseboard. Once he gave a quiet whine. Luke began marking the places with pencil. The marks formed a line nearly 9 feet long. That afternoon, while searching for electrical diagrams, Luke found Walter's maintenance ledgers. There were 11 of them. Black covers, dates written on the spines. Walter had documented everything. Lathe motor replaced, March 1998. South roof truss reinforced, September 2003. Fuel tank cleaned, May 2009. Compressor rebuilt, February 2012. Each entry included measurements, part numbers, costs, sometimes even weather conditions. Luke sat at the workbench turning pages. He understood men like Walter. Documentation wasn't paperwork. It was memory that couldn't lie. Near the back of one ledger, he found a hand-drawn floor plan. Luke stopped. He unfolded it. The workshop had been measured from exterior wall to exterior wall. Luke pulled out his tape. He started at the front. Office. Main bay. Machine area. Rear storage. He measured twice, then went outside through knee-deep snow and measured the building again. The difference was not inches, it was almost 4 feet. Luke stood behind the workshop, staring at the rear wall. The hillside rose nearby, but not against the building. There should have been 4 additional feet inside. There weren't. He went back in. Koda was waiting beside the plywood. All right. The dog's tail moved once. Luke removed the first sheet. Insulation, studs, nothing unusual. The second sheet showed the same. By the fourth, he was sweating despite the cold. He stepped back. Maybe Walter built a false wall for insulation. Koda sniffed along the exposed framing, then moved right. He stopped beneath a low storage shelf. Paw. Scratch. Koda. Scratch. Luke moved the shelf. Behind it ran an old baseboard darkened by decades of oil and dust. Koda touched one spot with his nose. Luke examined it. No visible latch. He ran his fingers underneath. Something cold touched his knuckle. Steel. He lowered himself onto one knee. A recessed lever had been hidden behind the trim. Luke stared at it. That's deliberate. Koda stood beside him. Luke pulled. Nothing. He changed the angle and tried again. Click. The sound was small. Somewhere inside the wall, weight shifted. A section of shelving moved forward less than an inch. Luke stood slowly. He pulled it farther. A narrow black opening appeared. Cold, stale air rolled into the workshop. Koda tried to move past him. Wait. Luke positioned himself beside the opening rather than directly in front of it and raised his flashlight. Old habits came without invitation. Ceiling, left corner, floor, right side. No movement, no obvious hazard. He opened the hidden section farther. The beam reached into a narrow room. Shelves, cases, paper boxes. Stay. Luke entered first. The space was perhaps 4 feet deep and 12 feet long. No windows. Ventilation piping ran overhead, explaining the draft. Maps covered one wall. Topographic maps, Forest Service maps, hand-marked trails. Several routes were labeled with dates. Luke recognized search grids. On another shelf were pulleys, climbing hardware, radio components, rescue straps, and pieces of equipment designed for hauling weight over rough terrain. Not treasure, not cash. A working archive. Koda whined behind him. Okay. The shepherd entered. He didn't investigate the shelves. He moved toward the far corner, then stopped. Luke's flashlight followed. Something hung from a nail. Red and black nylon. Faded. Dirty. A working dog harness. Luke didn't breathe for a moment. Koda approached it slowly. He sniffed the lower strap, then sat. Luke moved closer. There were hundreds of harnesses like it. Thousands. He told himself that before touching it. Then his thumb found the repair. Black stitching across the chest strap. Luke knew that stitching. He had made it himself one rainy afternoon after Koda tore the harness climbing through deadfall during a training exercise. No. The word barely came out. He turned the harness. Faded marker remained across the inside strap. D. Reeves/Koda. Luke's flashlight stopped moving. The hidden room seemed to shrink around him. Danny Reeves, his friend. The man whose dog now slept beside Luke's bed. The man Luke had believed had no connection to Walter beyond that single afternoon over coffee. Koda pressed his nose against the harness. His tail moved once. Not excitement. Recognition. Luke looked around again. The rescue maps, the equipment, the carefully labeled cases. Then at Koda. "How many times were you here?" The shepherd looked toward him. Luke reached for the harness. Behind it was a photograph turned face down against the wall. He pulled it free. Dust slid from the edges. 3 figures stood outside the workshop beneath summer sunlight. Walter Mercer, a younger Koda. And beside them, smiling with one hand resting on the dog's neck, stood Daniel Reeves. Luke sat down hard on an equipment case. He had come to Timber Hollow looking for the reason Scott wanted an old workshop. Instead, he had found proof that one of the people he trusted most had kept an entire piece of his life hidden. And Koda had remembered the way back. Luke stayed on the equipment case with the photograph in his hands. Danny looked younger in it. Not young exactly, just lighter. His beard was shorter, his shoulders less rigid. He wore faded work pants and a gray t-shirt with the sleeves pushed up. Walter stood beside him holding a steel cable fitting. Koda sat between them, perhaps 4 years old, ears straight, mouth open in the easy expression Luke remembered from before the dog's muzzle began turning gray. Behind them was the same workshop, not abandoned, alive. The doors stood open. Sunlight reached the concrete floor. Tools hung in their places. A rescue litter leaned against the wall. Luke turned the photograph over. June 18th, no year. Underneath, Walter had written 3 words. Danny, Koda. Good day. Luke rubbed his thumb across the writing. Why didn't you tell me? Koda lowered himself beside Luke's boots. Luke wasn't sure whether he was asking the dog or Danny. He spent the rest of that afternoon inside the hidden room. The papers weren't arranged like family records. They were working records. Equipment tests, search maps, repair lists, names of volunteer teams from across western Montana and northern Idaho. Walter had repaired cable systems, portable winches, snowmobile components, rescue litters, and climbing hardware. Danny's name began appearing in a ledger from several years earlier. At first, only occasionally. Danny Reeves brought damaged litter frame. Danny and Koda took radio packs north, then more often. Danny repaired trailer wiring. Danny helped test winch. Danny stayed late. One entry made Luke stop. Danny slept in truck again. Told him office cot is available. He said truck is easier. Luke read it twice. He knew what that meant. Danny had never told him. After Afghanistan, they had stayed in touch the way men sometimes do when they have seen too much of each other's lives to need constant conversation. A call every few weeks. A photograph. A bad joke at midnight. Danny would disappear for a month and return with, "Still ugly, Mercer?" Luke would answer, "Still talking, Reeves?" That had been enough. Or Luke had told himself it was. He turned another page. Danny arrived 5:40 a.m., hadn't slept. Put him on hydraulic assembly. Hands stopped shaking after breakfast. Luke leaned back. The workshop went quiet around him. He remembered calls he had ignored because he had been working. Messages he had answered 2 days late. Once Danny had called at 1:12 in the morning. Luke had watched the phone ring. He had been awake. He just hadn't wanted to talk. Danny never mentioned it. Koda nudged Luke's wrist. Luke closed the ledger. No. The word came out sharper than he intended. Koda stepped back. Luke immediately regretted it. "Not you." He rubbed both hands over his face. "Not you, buddy." Koda returned. Luke rested his palm against the dog's neck. That evening, he carried several journals into the main workshop and set them beside the stove. Snow tapped lightly against the roof. He ate from a can without heating it. Koda lay nearby with Walter's old glove beneath one paw. Luke read. Walter never described Danny as broken. That surprised him. He wrote about practical things. Danny hates enclosed rooms on bad nights. Danny needs door open. Koda wakes him before nightmares get bad. Danny worked 12 hours on rescue winch. Told him to go home twice. Ignored me twice. Another entry. Helicopter training today. Koda fine. Danny wasn't. Rotor noise got him. He walked behind equipment shed and stayed there 9 minutes. Came back and finished the job. Didn't mention it. Neither did I. Luke stopped chewing. He could see Danny doing exactly that. Not asking for attention. Not explaining. Just disappearing until his hands worked again. Luke looked toward the window. Snow moved through the beam of the exterior light. For years, Luke had carried a private version of Danny Reeves in his head. Danny, the steady one. Danny who made jokes when everyone else went quiet. Danny who could sleep anywhere. Danny who came home better than Luke did. Walter's journals dismantled that version one sentence at a time. Maybe Danny hadn't been better. Maybe he had simply been better at hiding the cost. The next morning, Luke found another box of photographs. Koda recognized several before Luke did. His nose touched one image. Walter and Danny stood beside a homemade cable rig stretched between 2 trees. Koda wore the red and black harness. Another showed Danny kneeling beside a volunteer search team. Another showed Koda covered in mud. Then Luke found one taken inside the workshop. Danny sat at Walter's workbench with his head lowered over a mechanical drawing. Walter stood behind him. Koda slept under the table. Luke turned it over. The writing was longer this time. Some men come here to repair machines. Some come because the machines give them a reason to return tomorrow. Luke stared at the sentence. Something tightened behind his throat. He set the photograph down carefully. Koda. The dog looked up. Luke had avoided the name for 2 years. He said, "Your old handler." He said, "My buddy." Sometimes, simply him. Danny's name had become a door Luke could walk past without opening. Now there was nowhere else to look. Danny. Koda stood immediately. Luke swallowed. "Danny brought you here." The dog crossed the room, his muzzle settled on Luke's knee. Luke put one hand over Koda's head. "Yeah." His voice broke on the single word. He stayed like that until the stove clicked and settled. No speech, no dramatic confession. Just a man, a dog, and the name of someone missing from both their lives. Later, Luke returned to the hidden room. He needed facts now. Facts were easier. He began sorting Walter's journals by date. One slipped from the stack and struck the floor. A wrench sitting on top of a case rolled off. It hit concrete with a hard metallic crack. Luke spun. His shoulder slammed into the wall. One hand came up defensively before he understood what had happened. For an instant, he saw sunlight flashing off torn metal. Dust. Danny shouting from somewhere he couldn't see. Then Koda stepped between Luke and the doorway. Not attacking. Not barking. He simply positioned himself there, looked toward the empty workshop, then back at Luke. Luke exhaled. Clear. Koda's ears relaxed. Luke picked up the wrench. His hand shook once, then stopped. He continued reading. Near the end of the final journal, a sentence caught his eye. Scott's name. Luke moved closer to the light. The entry was short. Scott asked about the lower records again. Told him they're none of his concern. Walter had underlined it twice. Luke read the previous page. Nothing. The next page. Nothing. He went backward through several months. Scott appeared 3 other times. Asked about old company files. Wanted original drawings. Asked whether lower storage was still dry. Luke's stomach tightened. Lower storage. Not hidden room. Not rear room. Lower. Luke looked down at the concrete floor beneath his boots. Koda had moved beside him. The shepherd's nose lowered toward the floor for a moment, then rose again. Luke remembered Scott's first offer. 40,000. Then 55. The dark pickup. The old tire marks. The fresh interest in a property Scott had laughed at. Luke closed the journal. He's not looking for the workshop. Koda watched him. Luke looked around Walter's hidden room. Maps, rescue equipment, Danny's harness, records, and somewhere, according to Walter, something lower. Scott had known about it before Walter died. Luke slipped the journal under his arm. For the first time since arriving in Timber Hollow, the mystery no longer felt like something Walter had left behind. It felt current. Someone else was still looking for it, and Luke had just opened the first door. Scott arrived the following afternoon. Luke heard the engine before the truck appeared. Koda heard it first. The shepherd lifted his head from beside the stove, crossed the workshop, and stopped short of the open doorway. Luke didn't move immediately. He wiped his hands on a rag and listened. One vehicle. Slow approach. No second engine. Through the window, a black SUV came around the bend and stopped beside Luke's Ford. Scott stepped out alone. His boots were too clean for Black Pine Road. Luke watched him stand in the clearing and study the workshop. Not the roof, not the 5 acres he'd supposedly become interested in. The rear section. Scott's gaze stayed there several seconds before he noticed Luke in the doorway. Then the smile arrived. You're actually staying here. For now. Scott climbed the steps. Koda remained beside Luke. Place looks better. I fixed a few things. Scott glanced inside. Luke shifted half a step. Not enough to look confrontational. Enough to keep Scott outside. Scott noticed. Still treating me like the enemy? I didn't know we had sides. We don't. Good. Wind moved through the pines. Scott shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I talked to somebody about the acreage. Luke waited. Developer out of Missoula. He's been buying old industrial parcels. Cabins, recreation properties, that kind of thing. There's no cabin. Could build one. Road's bad. People pay for privacy. Luke almost smiled. 3 weeks ago, the property had been a scrap pile. Now it was an investment. Scott looked toward the trees. I can offer you 150. Luke said nothing. Scott turned back. $150,000. Cash purchase. Quick closing. The number hung between them. Nearly 5 times the appraisal. Luke scratched Koda behind the damaged ear. Who's the developer? Private group. Name? I'd have to check. You drove all the way up here with a $150,000 offer and don't know who's buying it? Scott's mouth tightened. It's my money. I'd buy it, then work with them. Why? Why what? Why do you care this much? Scott looked past Luke into the workshop. His eyes traveled over the machinery. Workbench, shelving, then farther back, toward the section Luke had closed again that morning. Only for a second. Luke saw it. You found something, Scott said. Luke kept his face still. Found a leaking roof, I'm serious. So am I. Scott stepped closer. Luke, this place isn't what you think. What do I think it is? A project. Something you can fix because fixing things makes you feel useful. Luke's jaw tightened. Scott continued. You know what old machine shops can contain? Asbestos, solvents, lead, fuel contamination. If that tank leaked into the soil, cleanup alone could cost more than this property will ever be worth. Those risks were real. That was what made the warning effective. Luke looked at him. Then why do you want it? Scott hesitated. A mistake. Small. But Luke had spent years learning to notice the space between a question and an answer. Because I can absorb the risk. That's generous. There you go again. What? Acting like everyone is trying to work you. Luke looked toward the SUV. No passenger. Rear windows tinted. Mud along the lower doors. Did Danny ever talk to you about this place? Scott's eyes shifted. Barely. Rear wall. Then Luke. Danny who? Luke felt something cold settle in his stomach. Reeves. Scott shook his head. No. Too quick. Luke nodded. Okay. Scott stared at him. Take the money. I'll think about it. You said that at 40. And I'm still thinking. Scott's expression finally lost its polish. Don't wait until this place costs you something. He walked back to the SUV. Luke watched until the vehicle disappeared down Black Pine Road. Only then did he look at Koda. He knew the name. Koda sniffed the air Scott had left behind. That evening, the temperature fell fast. Luke ate early, then took Koda around the property before darkness settled completely. The dog moved more slowly on uneven ground. His old hind leg injury always showed itself in cold weather, a slight stiffness during the first few steps after stopping. Near the equipment shed, Koda froze. Luke stopped with him. Koda's nose lifted. Then came a low growl. Not loud. Luke switched off his flashlight. The clearing went dark. He waited for his eyes to adjust. Nothing. He crouched beside Koda. What? The dog moved toward the rear wall. Luke followed. Beneath the workshop window, Koda sniffed the snow. Luke lowered his light and shielded the beam with his fingers. Boot print. Fresh. Another several feet away. The impressions crossed yesterday's snow crust and headed toward the rear siding. Luke didn't follow them immediately. Instead, he backed away, moved through the equipment shed, came around from the opposite side where the trees gave him a view down Black Pine Road. A faint shape sat far below the property. Vehicle. Lights off. Luke stayed behind a pine trunk. No movement. He could barely make out the roofline. Dark pickup or SUV, too far to identify. Koda stood beside him without making a sound. Luke counted slowly. 1 minute. 2. The vehicle remained. He returned to the workshop by a different route. At the rear wall, he examined the siding. Fresh scratches showed beside two fasteners. A tool had been pushed beneath the metal, not enough to open it, enough to test it. Someone had been checking for another way inside. Luke photographed the marks and boot prints before touching anything. Then he called Mara Bennett. She answered on the fourth ring. "Luke? I need legal advice. That sentence usually costs money. Send me the bill." What happened? He told her about Scott's offer. The questions, the tracks, the damaged siding. Mara was quiet for a moment. "Have you found anything inside the workshop?" Luke looked toward the hidden wall. "Yes." "What?" "Records. Rescue equipment. Journals. Anything valuable?" "I don't know yet." "Then don't assume it's worthless and don't remove anything unnecessarily. Photograph where you found it. Keep copies of every page that mentions Scott." Luke looked down the dark workshop. "What if someone comes back? Call the sheriff. Don't confront anybody." "I wasn't planning to." "I mean it, Luke." "So do I," Mara exhaled. "I'll pull the estate file again tomorrow. I want to see whether Walter left references to storage areas that weren't included in the appraisal." Luke rubbed his forehead. "There's something else." "What?" "Scott offered me $40,000 for a property appraised at 31, then 55. Today he drove into the mountains and offered 150. Silence. Luke looked through the window toward the snow. "Nobody offers 5 times appraisal and then checks your walls after dark." "No," Mara said. "They don't." "Tomorrow I'll," Koda barked. One explosive warning from outside. Luke turned. "Koda?" The dog had been beside the stove less than a minute earlier. Now the doorway was empty. A second bark came from beyond the equipment shed. Then it cut off. Luke's grip tightened around the phone. "Mara, call the county sheriff. Give them Walter Mercer's property on Black Pine Road." "Luke, what happened?" He was already moving. "Koda." No answer. Luke grabbed his coat and flashlight. He reached the door, stopped himself from charging blindly into darkness, and swept the clearing from cover first. Left. Center. Tree line. No visible person. Then he saw tracks leading toward the equipment shed. Koda's. Luke moved. Fast, controlled steps. The snow reflected the flashlight in hard white flashes. "Koda!" A sound came from behind the shed. Not a bark. A short, strained whine. Luke rounded the corner. His flashlight dropped toward the snow. Red spots marked the white surface. 3, then 5, then more. Koda. The shepherd was down beside the fence line, twisting toward his rear leg. Something thin and metallic caught Luke's flashlight. Wire, tight around Koda's leg, and fixed to the base of an old steel post. Luke dropped to one knee. Koda turned sharply, teeth flashing for an instant from pain. Luke froze. "It's me." The dog's eyes found him. Recognition came. Koda lowered his head into the snow. Luke reached slowly toward the wire. His hands were already steady. But somewhere beyond the clearing, hidden among the black pines, a branch snapped. Luke looked up. Someone might still be watching. The woods beyond the equipment shed were black except where moonlight caught the snow between the pines. Another branch moved. Then nothing. Luke's first instinct was to pursue. Find the tracks. Gain distance from Koda. See who was out there before whoever it was disappeared. He killed the impulse immediately. Koda came first. Luke shifted until the steel post protected part of his back and lowered the flashlight. "Easy, buddy." The wire had looped around Koda's right rear leg just above the paw. Thin steel cable, crude but effective. The more the dog had pulled, the tighter it had drawn. Blood darkened the fur beneath it. Luke reached toward him. Pain moved faster than recognition. Koda snapped once. His teeth stopped inches from Luke's wrist. The shepherd froze. Luke did too. Then Koda's ears lowered. A small sound came from his throat. "You're okay." Luke kept his voice low. "You didn't do anything wrong." He took a compact cutter from his multi-tool pouch. One hand steadied the cable. Snip. The tension released. Koda tried to stand. No. He tried again. Stay. This time he obeyed. Luke inspected the leg without manipulating it more than necessary. The cable had opened the skin, but he couldn't see exposed tendon or obvious deformity. He pressed sterile gauze against the wound. Koda trembled. Luke removed his own belt, folded a towel beneath Koda's belly, and used it as support. Then he lifted. 70+ pounds of shepherd came against his chest. Koda objected immediately, pushing weakly with his front legs. Yeah, your dignity will survive." Luke carried him toward the workshop. Halfway there, the beam of his flashlight crossed the blood on Koda's fur. Red against sable. The clearing vanished. Red dust, rotor wash, a helicopter descending beyond a wall. Danny somewhere behind a damaged vehicle. A radio voice talking too fast. Someone shouting for a casualty count. Luke remembered his own hands counting because numbers were easier than faces. 1, 2, 3. Koda shifted in his arms. Luke stopped walking. His breathing had gone shallow. Snow touched his face. Workshop, Montana, Koda, now. Not there, Luke whispered. The dog looked up at him. Luke adjusted his grip. Not there. He carried Koda inside. On the workbench, he cut away fur around the injury, rinsed the wound with clean water, controlled the bleeding, and wrapped it carefully. He checked the paw repeatedly for warmth and circulation. Koda watched every movement. When Luke finished, the shepherd tried to stand. His injured leg touched the concrete. He immediately lifted it again. That's what I thought. Luke spread his sleeping bag beside the stove. Koda lowered himself onto it. Only then did Luke call Sheriff Caldwell. Mara had already reached dispatch. Caldwell's voice was calm and practical. Don't go looking for whoever did it. Wasn't planning to. Good. Road conditions are getting worse. Deputy can be there, but it'll take time. Luke looked through the workshop window. Snow was beginning again. I photographed the wire before I cut him loose. Keep it. Don't handle it more than you already have. Luke glanced at the cable on the floor. This wasn't old. You sure? Koda's walked that route every night. It wasn't there yesterday. Caldwell paused. Understood. The nearest emergency veterinarian was more than an hour away under good conditions. These weren't good conditions. Luke waited until the deputy arrived, gave him the photographs and location, then loaded Koda into the truck. The drive down Black Pine Road took nearly twice as long as usual. Luke kept one hand light on the wheel. Every few minutes, he looked toward the passenger side. Koda lay on a folded blanket. His eyes stayed open. I'm here. The dog's tail tapped once. At the clinic, the veterinarian examined the wound, cleaned it properly, and took x-rays. No fracture, she said. Luke looked at Koda's bandaged leg. Tendon? Looks intact. He was lucky. Luke's mouth tightened. Somebody set it deliberately. The veterinarian looked at him. For him? I don't know. But Luke did know one thing. The snare hadn't been placed randomly in the woods. It had been set along the exact path Koda used around the workshop. Someone had watched long enough to learn the dog's routine. That thought followed Luke all the way back to Timber Hollow. By the time they reached the workshop, morning was beginning to pale the eastern sky. Luke carried Koda inside again. The dog tolerated it with offended silence. Doctor said rest. Koda looked toward the rear wall. No. Luke pointed toward the sleeping bag. Rest. Koda lowered himself. Luke sat beside him. He didn't sleep. He cleaned his tools, made coffee, checked the windows, checked them again. At noon, Mara called. Luke told her about the snare. Her response was immediate. You leave. No. Luke. Someone wants me gone. That's exactly why you leave. No. That's why I don't give them an empty building. Mara was silent. Luke softened his voice. I'm not going looking for trouble. Caldwell knows. I'll put cameras up. I'll keep the doors locked. You're treating this like an operation. Luke looked at Koda. No. If I were treating it like an operation, I wouldn't still be here. That evening, he installed temporary motion lights and 2 battery cameras he bought in town. He marked the snare location, photographed the tire impressions again. Then he walked the perimeter alone. The absence of Koda beside him felt wrong, too quiet. At every corner, Luke expected the soft crunch of 4 paws behind him. When he returned, Koda was waiting at the office door. Don't even think about it. Koda limped forward. Luke pointed back. The dog stopped. For the first time, Luke noticed how old he looked. Gray around the muzzle, 1 damaged ear, bandage around the rear leg. A dog carrying injuries from a life that had begun before Luke became responsible for him. Danny had trusted him with Koda, and Luke had brought him somewhere somebody was willing to hurt him. That thought stayed. At midnight, Luke was still awake on the floor beside the dog. At 1:30, he checked the security cameras. Nothing. At 2:46, he woke from a few minutes of sleep with his hand gripping the edge of the sleeping bag. Koda was breathing steadily. Luke put his palm against the dog's ribs until the rhythm convinced his body of what his eyes already knew. Alive. Safe. At 3:40, Koda moved. Luke opened his eyes. No. The shepherd stood carefully. He favored the bandaged leg and crossed the workshop. Koda. He kept going. Not toward the outside door, toward Walter's hidden room. Luke followed. You're supposed to be resting. Koda entered the narrow space and past Danny's harness. Past the maps. Past the shelves where he had stopped before. He went to the far end, then lowered his nose. Not to the wall, to the concrete floor behind a heavy shelving unit. He sniffed, moved 6 inches, sniffed again, then scratched once with his good front paw. Luke's irritation disappeared. Koda. Scratch. Luke crouched. He ran his fingers across the concrete. At first, nothing. Then he felt it. A straight line beneath decades of dust, too straight to be a crack. Luke wiped the surface clean. A seam continued beneath the shelving. He followed it with the flashlight. Right angle. Another seam. A rectangle. Luke slowly looked at the journal sitting on the nearby workbench. Walter's words returned. Lower records. Koda scratched again. Luke put a hand against his shoulder. Easy. The dog stopped. Luke stared at the floor. The hidden wall had concealed a room, but the hidden room was concealing something else. And whatever Scott Mercer had been searching for wasn't behind Walter's wall. It was underneath it. Luke didn't open the floor. Not yet. At 3:40 in the morning, alone in an isolated workshop with an injured dog, and evidence that someone had already been prowling the property, curiosity was not a good enough reason to move a 100-pound shelving unit. He photographed the seams, measured the rectangle, 46 inches by 32, then he covered the area exactly as he'd found it. Koda watched from the doorway. Tomorrow. Luke pointed toward the office. Now you're going back to bed. By sunrise, the mountain had disappeared. Clouds swallowed the ridgeline. Snow came sideways through the pines, fine at first, then heavy enough that the workshop across the clearing blurred behind white. Luke checked the weather radio. Winter storm warning, high winds, accumulations measured in feet at higher elevations. Black Pine Road would become difficult before noon and possibly impassable by evening. Mara called at 8. Leave while you can. Luke stood beside the window. I've got heat, food, fuel, and a satellite communicator. You also have someone setting traps around your building. Caldwell knows I'm here. That isn't the same as having a deputy outside. Luke looked toward Koda. The dog was asleep near the stove, bandaged legs stretched awkwardly beside him. I'll stay inside. Mara gave a humorless laugh. You aren't good at sounding convincing. Before Luke could answer, the lights died. The generator coughed outside. Once, twice, silence. Luke looked at the ceiling. I'll call you back. He layered up and stepped into the storm. Visibility had dropped below 50 yards. Snow stung his cheeks. The generator's intake was packed with wind-driven powder. Luke cleared it, checked the fuel, restarted the machine, and waited until its rhythm settled. Koda watched from the doorway. Inside, the dog remained. Luke pointed. That's not a suggestion. Koda limped back toward the stove. By afternoon, the workshop had become an island. Luke's cameras showed nothing except blowing snow. At 5, he checked the satellite communicator. Full charge. At 7, he heated stew. At 9, he inspected the doors. At 11, he walked the interior again. The storm grew louder. Branches scraped the roof. Wind pressed against the steel siding in long groans. Every sound had to be sorted. Weather. Building. Weather. Building. At 2:06 a.m., Luke opened his eyes. He hadn't heard anything. Koda had. The shepherd stood beside the office door. Head low, body rigid. One sharp bark, then silence. Luke sat up. Show me. Koda looked toward the equipment bay. Luke killed the office lamp. Darkness swallowed the workshop. For several seconds there was only wind. Then, ting, metal touching metal, not the roof, lower, near the bay door. Luke stood without rushing. Boots, coat, satellite communicator into pocket, flashlight left off. Koda started forward. Luke caught his harness. With me. Another sound. A controlled scrape. Someone was working the door. Luke didn't approach it. He moved through the workshop using machinery between himself and the sound, stopping where the old lathe gave him a protected angle toward the bay. The door shifted. A narrow line of darkness appeared, then widened. 2 figures entered. Luke could see only outlines. One taller, one heavier through the shoulders. Neither turned toward the visible machinery. They went directly toward the rear. The hidden room. Luke felt the last piece of doubt disappear. They knew. He backed toward the office. Koda stayed against his left leg despite the bandage. Luke took out the satellite communicator and sent the emergency message he'd prepared earlier. Intruders inside Walter Mercer property. 2, Black Pine Road, need sheriff. The device confirmed transmission. Now distance, cover, time. Luke had no intention of fighting 2 unknown men over paperwork. He reached the office. Koda suddenly stopped. Luke tugged lightly. Come. The shepherd refused. His nose turned toward the hidden room. Not the intruders, the floor. Luke followed his gaze. From this angle, beneath the shelving, he could see something he had missed earlier. A narrow steel gap. One of the men whispered, Move the rack. They were close. Luke understood. The intruders weren't searching. They knew the exact location. Koda pulled toward the hidden room. No. The dog strained once. Luke heard the shelving scrape. They were exposing the floor seam. One man muttered, "It's here!" Luke backed farther toward the office. Then his heel struck a loose steel bracket. Clink. Silence. The intruders stopped. Luke's body changed before thought arrived. Weight balanced, breathing shallow, eyes fixed on the doorway. A flashlight beam swept across the workshop. There. Footsteps came fast. Luke moved. Office. Koda followed. Almost. His injured rear leg slipped on the concrete. The dog stumbled. Luke turned back. That second cost him. A figure appeared between the machines. A metal bar rose. Luke shifted away instead of closing distance. The bar struck the edge of the workbench with a violent crack. White light flashed behind Luke's eyes. For half a second, Montana became Afghanistan. Metal. Shouting. Contact. Danny's voice. Luke forced the image away. Guard. The command left his mouth quietly. Koda transformed. Not into a wild animal, into a working dog remembering a job. He planted himself between Luke and the advancing man. The intruder swung again. Koda! The shepherd lunged. The metal bar glanced across Koda's shoulder. The sound Koda made tore through Luke harder than the impact itself, but the dog's weight hit the man's legs. The intruder lost balance and crashed against the bench. Luke grabbed Koda's harness. Back! Koda released immediately. Luke pulled him into the office and slammed the heavy door. The lock turned. A blow struck the other side. Then another. Luke shoved a steel filing cabinet against it. Koda stood beside him. His breathing came fast. Blood darkened the fur along his shoulder. No, no. Luke crouched. Koda remained facing the door. Look at me. The shepherd finally turned. Luke ran his hand carefully along the shoulder. No obvious deformity. A split in the skin. Bleeding, but not pouring. Outside, one intruder shouted. The other answered from farther away. Then a new sound rose beneath the storm. Faint. Growing. Sirens. Luke stayed behind cover. The pounding stopped. Footsteps ran across the workshop. A door crashed open. Cold wind rushed through the building. Minutes later, voices called from outside. County Sheriff's Office! Luke answered without opening immediately. He verified them through the office window first, then moved the cabinet. Deputies entered. One suspect had made it only 50 yards before slipping near the drainage ditch. The second had disappeared into the timber. Sheriff Tom Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later in a snow-covered four-wheel drive truck. Luke was sitting on the office floor beside Koda. Caldwell crouched. Dog okay? Need a vet. We'll get him out. A deputy entered carrying a clear evidence bag. We found this on the guy we detained. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. Caldwell opened it carefully. Hand-drawn workshop plan. Rear wall, hidden room, shelving. And beneath it, a rectangle marked with an arrow. Lower vault. Luke stared at the drawing. Who is he? Caldwell looked toward the deputy. ID says Dean Keller. Luke knew the name. Walter's Journals, former employee, a man who had worked in this building years ago. Caldwell pointed to the diagram. Looks like Mr. Keller knew exactly where he was going. Luke looked toward Koda. The shepherd was still watching the workshop door despite the blood on his shoulder. Someone had injured him once to keep Luke away. Tonight, Koda had been hurt again, keeping someone else from reaching Luke. Luke rested his hand against the dog's neck. Beyond them, deputies moved through Walter's hidden room. One called for Caldwell. They had shifted the shelving. The steel rectangle beneath it was fully visible now. Not a seam. A hatch. And Dean Keller had carried a map showing exactly what lay beneath it. Luke didn't open it. Not that night. The storm still hammered the roof while deputies photographed the hidden room, the damaged bay door, the pry marks, and the steel hatch beneath Walter's shelving. Luke barely watched them. He sat on the office floor with Koda between his knees. The shepherd's breathing had slowed, but blood continued to work through the temporary dressing around his shoulder. Luke replaced the gauze. Koda flinched. Sorry. Luke loosened the wrap, checked the wound, then started again. His fingers knew how to work carefully even when the rest of him wanted to move too fast. Pressure. Check bleeding. Clean dressing. Not too tight. Koda's old leg injury was still bandaged from the snare. Now one shoulder had been shaved around a fresh split in the skin. Luke stared at him. 2 injuries. Both here. Both because Luke had stayed. You should have been home sleeping on my floor. Koda rested his chin against Luke's thigh. Luke looked away. Outside, a deputy's flashlight passed across the window. For an instant, the moving beam became something else. White light through dust. A convoy halted on a road in Afghanistan. Luke heard radio chatter that wasn't there. His own voice giving a direction. Danny answering. Then the memory broke apart before reaching the part Luke had spent years avoiding. He pressed his palm against Koda's ribs. Warm, steady, here. The veterinary clinic couldn't safely send anyone up Black Pine Road until the storm eased. The veterinarian talked Luke through what to watch for over the phone. The bleeding slowed. Koda could bear weight. No obvious fracture. Those were good signs. Luke repeated them to himself like coordinates. At 4:30, Sheriff Caldwell came into the office. We've got Keller secured. Luke looked up. The other one? Tracks disappear near the lower road. Storm's filling them faster than we can follow safely. Scott? Caldwell studied him. We don't know. Luke nodded. He didn't need the sheriff to say more. Not yet. Caldwell looked at Koda. How's he doing? Better than he should be. That's a tough dog. Luke ran one hand along Koda's neck. He's had practice. Caldwell sat on the edge of Walter's desk. There's something else. Keller said enough on the ride down that I think your lawyer needs to hear the rest before you do anything with that hatch. Luke's eyes moved toward the workshop. What did he say? Mercer papers. Luke looked back. That's what he called them? Twice. What are they? He wouldn't say. Caldwell stood. He did say Scott's name. That landed quietly. No surprise. Only confirmation. Scott paid him? That's what Keller claims. For tonight? For more than tonight, from the sound of it. Luke stared through the office doorway. The hidden room remained illuminated by portable work lights. Walter's old maps hung beyond the open false wall. Danny's harness was still on its nail. And beneath all of it waited the steel hatch. Caldwell followed Luke's gaze. Don't open it until Bennett gets here. I won't. You mean that? Luke looked at Koda. Yeah. This time he did. The storm weakened near dawn. The sudden quiet felt unnatural. Snow slid from the workshop roof in heavy sheets. The generator turned steadily outside. Deputies came and went with muted voices. For the first time since the break-in, nobody was running. Luke sat beside Koda. He hadn't slept. His coffee had gone cold. Near 6, Koda woke fully and tried to rise. Easy. The shepherd pushed himself upright. His shoulder trembled. Luke supported him. Koda leaned into Luke's leg instead of pretending he didn't need help. That almost hurt worse. Luke lowered himself beside him. For several minutes he said nothing. Then he looked at the battered harness hanging inside the hidden room. Danny got hurt because of me. Koda's ears moved. Luke stared at the floor. Their final deployment together had been years before Danny's later death in the Montana mountains. Different country, different danger. But Luke had carried one afternoon home as if the calendar had never advanced beyond it. We had a route that looked wrong. His voice was barely above the generator. Nothing I could prove. Just wrong. He rubbed his thumb against a scar on his palm. I made the call to keep moving. The memory came in pieces. A road washed white by sun. A wall. A radio pressed against his vest. Danny watching him from another vehicle. Luke giving the signal. Then noise. Dust. Metal. Afterward, Danny had survived. He had even told Luke to stop blaming himself. Luke never had. Maybe stopping would have made it worse. Maybe not. Koda moved closer. Luke swallowed. I don't know, The dog placed his muzzle against Luke's knee. I've been trying to solve that for years. Koda closed his eyes. No answer. No forgiveness delivered like a miracle. Just weight against Luke's leg. Luke put his hand on the dog's head. You're not him, a pause. I know that. Koda breathed out. But you're what he trusted me with. Luke sat there until daylight turned the windows gray. By late morning, Black Pine Road was passable again. The veterinarian cleaned Koda's shoulder properly and closed the deeper section of the cut. No fracture. Heavy bruising. Rest. Antibiotics. Limited movement. Luke listened to every instruction. Koda listened to none of them. By early afternoon, Mara Bennett arrived with Sheriff Caldwell. She took one look at Koda. Please tell me you're leaving after this. Luke nodded toward the hidden room. After that, Mara removed her gloves. Fair enough. Caldwell had more information. Dean Keller had worked for Walter years earlier and knew the workshop contained records connected to Walter's old business ventures. He claimed Scott had paid him to locate them long before Walter died. How long? Luke asked. Years. Luke looked at Mara. So the offers weren't guesses? No, she said. Probably not. Caldwell continued. Keller says he never knew exactly how to access the lower compartment. Walter kept that to himself. The diagram came from measurements and old renovation notes Keller collected. And the snare? Caldwell's expression hardened. Still investigating. Luke's hand settled on Koda's neck. He didn't ask again. The three of them entered the hidden room. Koda limped behind Luke. Mara pointed at him. Limited movement. Luke looked down. You hear that? Koda continued walking. Caldwell almost smiled. Together, they moved the shelving. The hatch appeared completely. Steel, recessed hinges, a lifting ring hidden beneath a thin layer of dust. Luke crouched. His hand closed around the ring. For years, when something dangerous or uncertain appeared in front of him, his instinct had been the same. Go first. Check it alone. Keep everyone else back. He began to lift, then stopped. His grip loosened. Mara waited. Caldwell said nothing. Luke looked at Koda. The dog stood beside him on 3 good legs and one carefully placed injured one. Luke rested his hand against the shepherd's neck. Together. He lifted. The seal released with a low breath of cold air. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Luke raised his flashlight. Koda's ears came forward. For once, Luke didn't step through the unknown before everyone else. Caldwell moved beside him. Mara stayed just behind. Koda pressed against Luke's leg, and together they opened Walter Mercer's final door. Cold air climbed the narrow stairs. Not damp air. Dry. Preserved. Luke aimed his flashlight downward before moving. 8 concrete steps disappeared beneath the workshop, ending at a small landing. Caldwell went first this time. Luke followed with Koda close behind. Mara came last. The room was smaller than Luke expected. No stacks of money, no gold bars, no hidden arsenal. Steel shelves lined 3 walls, filled with document boxes wrapped in heavy plastic. A long work table stood in the center. On it sat several metal prototypes, cable fittings, compact pulley assemblies, and mechanical parts Luke couldn't immediately identify. Everything had labels, dates, numbers, Walter's handwriting. Mara swept her flashlight across the nearest shelf. "Don't touch anything yet." Luke almost laughed. "I've heard that before. I mean it more this time." Caldwell photographed the room. Koda sniffed along the first shelf, then moved toward the far corner. Luke watched him carefully. Easy. The dog stopped beside a wooden crate. His nose touched the lid. No scratching, no excitement. He simply stood there. Luke approached. Stenciled across the wood were faded words. Black Pine Cable Systems Prototype Components, 1979. Mara crouched beside another box. Corporate records. Luke looked at her. Meaning we're going to need someone who understands what Walter owned, what he sold, and what still exists. She pointed toward a row of binders. Those could be worthless historical paperwork. Then toward the sealed boxes, or they could be the reason somebody broke into this building during a snowstorm. Luke's flashlight found photographs pinned to a corkboard. Logging equipment. Mountain rescue crews. A tracked vehicle pulling a loaded sled through deep snow. An early cable system stretched across a ravine. Walter appeared in several pictures, younger and broad-shouldered. Another man stood beside him. Then another. Luke moved closer. A photograph near the bottom was newer. Danny. Koda. Walter. Luke felt Koda lean against his leg. "Yeah." Mara looked over. "What?" "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Danny had been down here too. On the work table sat a small digital recorder sealed inside a plastic bag. A strip of masking tape crossed the front. "Luke." Nobody spoke. Mara looked at him. "That's pretty specific." Luke picked up the recorder. The batteries had corroded years ago, but a memory card remained inside. Mara insisted they document it before doing anything else. By evening, copies had been made. The original card went into evidence storage. A digital copy went to Mara. Luke kept another, then began the waiting. 3 days became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became 6. The records moved through attorneys, accountants, corporate historians, and a valuation specialist in Missoula. Luke hated that part. Waiting had no bolts to tighten, no board to cut, no measurable progress. So he repaired the workshop. Koda recovered beside him. The snare wound closed first. The shoulder took longer. When Koda tried to follow him up a ladder, Luke pointed at the floor. "Absolutely not." Koda sat, waited until Luke turned around, then stood again. "I can still see you." Koda sat. Hank Dalton came by one morning carrying coffee and an old photograph of Walter beside a cable winch. "Your uncle was stubborn." "Great uncle." "Still stubborn." Hank ran a hand across Walter's workbench. Back in the 70s, loggers were getting equipment into country where roads barely deserved the name. Walter started building retrieval systems. Then, rescue crews realized the same equipment could move injured people. Luke looked toward the lower hatch. "Black Pine Cable Systems?" Hank's eyebrows rose. "Where'd you hear that?" "Found the name." Hank whistled softly. That takes me back. The answer came in January. Mara drove up just after noon. She carried a thick folder. Luke knew immediately that whatever was inside had changed something. She didn't remove her coat. Sit down. I'd rather stand. I know. Luke stayed standing. Koda lay beside the stove. Mara opened the folder. Walter was one of 3 founders of Black Pine Cable Systems. The company changed names twice, merged once, and eventually became part of a specialty manufacturer that still produces rugged terrain recovery and rescue equipment. Luke waited. Walter retained an ownership interest. How much? That's complicated. Usually means expensive. It means old records, stock conversions, a merger agreement, and ownership. Nobody in your family apparently bothered to trace correctly. She turned several pages toward him. The documents downstairs include original certificates, correspondence, and agreements that establish Walter's position far more clearly than the later estate files did. Luke looked at numbers he didn't understand. Mara tapped the final page. Preliminary valuation puts the interest at approximately $3.8 million. The generator hummed outside. A piece of wood settled in the stove. Luke stared at her. 3.8. Approximately. This still has to survive legal and corporate review. You don't have $3.8 million sitting in an account tomorrow morning. Luke looked toward the hidden wall. So that's what Scott wanted. That's my working theory. Luke thought of 40,000, 55, 150. The boot prints, the snare, Dean Keller entering during the storm. All of it for paper. Not treasure. Proof. Mara closed the folder. There's something else. Luke looked at her. The recording. She placed a laptop on Walter's workbench. I had it cleaned up. Luke sat down then. Koda raised his head. Mara pressed play. Static filled the workshop. Then an old man's voice. Thin, rough. Walter. Luke, if you're watching this, Koda remembered. Luke stopped breathing for a second. Koda's ears lifted at the voice. Walter continued. Danny said he would. Luke's eyes moved toward the dog. He said that animal could forget a meal before he'd forget a place where somebody needed him. A dry cough came through the recording. I suppose by now you've found the papers. Mara will explain them better than I can. Money was never the hard part. Luke leaned forward. Walter's voice softened. Danny came here because he needed work that mattered. He told me once you were the same kind of fool. Luke's mouth moved despite himself. A faint smile. He worried about you, Luke. More than he ever told you. The smile disappeared. After his accident, I thought about sending you the papers. Thought money might give you a clean start. Walter paused. Then I remembered what Danny said. The recording crackled. Don't give Luke something he can spend. Give him something he has to build. Luke lowered his eyes. Beside the stove, Koda stood. He crossed the workshop slowly, the stiffness still visible in his rear leg. Walter continued. Give him work. Give him responsibility. Give him somewhere that can't be repaired in one afternoon. If he gets angry, let him. He's good at angry. Luke let out a broken breath. And if he gets lost, trust Koda. That dog always knew which one of you needed finding. Koda reached Luke. Luke put a hand on his head. Walter's voice became quieter. The workshop was never a consolation prize. I needed Scott to believe it was worthless. I needed everybody to believe that. Luke looked at Mara. She was watching the screen. Not him. I couldn't know how things would end, Walter said. I only knew Danny asked me for one thing before that mountain took him. A pause. Don't let Mercer disappear. Luke's hand tightened gently in Koda's fur. So I didn't. The recording continued for another few seconds. Then Walter said the last words. The papers are yours if the law says they're yours. What you do with them is your business. But the workshop, another cough. The workshop is the reason I left you the key. The audio ended. Silence filled the building. Luke remained seated. $3.8 million sat in Mara's folder. He didn't look at it. He looked instead at Danny's battered harness hanging inside the open wall, then at Koda. The dog rested his chin on Luke's knee. Luke finally understood. Walter hadn't hidden a fortune and hoped the right person stumbled across it. He had built a trail, the worthless inheritance, the key, the instruction about the dog, the concealed wall, Danny's harness, the lower room. Each piece had been placed so Luke couldn't reach the end without walking through the parts of Danny's life he'd never known. Luke slowly rubbed the scarred edge of Koda's ear. You knew. Koda blinked. Maybe he knew, maybe he only remembered smells, rooms, footsteps, and the places where Danny had once been alive. It didn't matter, because Walter had trusted that memory more than he trusted any lock. And Danny had trusted the dog to do something neither money nor family had managed to do. Bring Luke back. The money brought lawyers before it brought anything else. Mara warned Luke that old ownership records did not become millions of dollars simply because somebody found them under a floor. Every certificate had to be authenticated. Every merger had to be traced. Every transfer had to survive review. Luke was fine with that. For once, he wasn't in a hurry. Scott was. 3 days after Walter's recording was recovered, Mara received a settlement offer from Scott's attorney. Luke was replacing damaged siding when she called. He's offering you $200,000. Luke drove another screw into the wall. For what? A full release. No civil claims connected to the property, the attempted purchase, or anything involving Dean Keller. Luke stopped. And the break-in? His lawyer carefully avoids admitting Scott had anything to do with it. The snare? Same answer. Luke looked through the open workshop door. Koda lay beside the stove, his shaved shoulder showing a line of healing stitches. The bandage had finally come off his rear leg, leaving a narrow red scar above the paw. $200,000. Luke looked at that scar. No. I expected that. I'm not negotiating. Mara paused. Luke, refusing a private settlement doesn't mean you control what criminal charges are filed. I know, and proving every part of Scott's involvement may take time. I know that too. Then what do you want? Luke looked across the workshop at Walter's tools. I want him to stop buying silence. Mara was quiet. Then she said, That's clear enough. Luke returned to the siding. He didn't call Scott, didn't threaten him, didn't drive down the mountain looking for answers. That surprised Luke more than anyone. There had been a time when anger demanded motion from him. A door slammed. An engine started. Boots hit ground. Now he gave Caldwell the photographs, gave Mara the journals, gave investigators copies of Walter's records. Then he went back to work. Dean Keller eventually gave them the missing pieces. Scott had first approached him years earlier after hearing Walter still possessed original documents from Black Pine Cable Systems. Dean knew about the lower storage area from his years working at the shop, but Walter had never shown him the access point. Scott paid him to search old building plans, then to watch the property, then to recover the papers if an opportunity came. Luke's inheritance had created that opportunity. Scott expected him to sell. When Luke didn't, The pressure increased. The offers, the warnings, the nighttime visits, the break-in. Caldwell came to the workshop one cold morning in February. Luke was sharpening a planer blade. "Scott's been charged." Luke switched off the grinder. Caldwell listed the allegations connected to the conspiracy, unlawful entry, and the trap that injured Koda. He made no promises about convictions. Courts move slow. Luke glanced at Koda. So does he. Koda was crossing the workshop stiffly after a nap. Caldwell smiled. Still gets where he's going. Usually before me. Emily had been questioned too. Investigators believed she knew about Scott's attempts to acquire the property, though how much she knew about the later actions remained less clear. Luke didn't ask for details. He had spent enough years replaying other people's decisions. He wasn't going to build another life around Scott's. The corporate review took months. By spring, Mara could finally tell him that Walter's ownership interest was legitimate and that Luke's claim through the estate had survived the first major challenges. The valuation remained close to $3.8 million. Luke sat across from her at Walter's old desk. "So what do rich people do now?" Mara smiled. "Usually hire people to stop them from doing something stupid." "Sounds expensive." "Less expensive than doing something stupid." He looked around the workshop. The roof no longer leaked. The generator had been serviced. The rear siding was repaired. Danny's harness still hung inside the open hidden room. "Don't worry," Luke said. "I've already got somewhere to waste it." Mara's smile faded into curiosity. "Meaning?" Luke opened one of the document boxes from below. Not Walter's corporate papers. Danny's. They had found it behind a row of equipment specifications. Inside were maps, budgets, handwritten notes, and a proposal that had never been submitted. The title was simple: Black Pine Regional Rescue Works. Danny had outlined a workshop that could repair equipment for volunteer search and rescue teams that couldn't afford commercial service rates. But that wasn't all. He wanted veterans working there. Machining, welding, carpentry, vehicle maintenance, radio installation, wilderness logistics, jobs with visible results, skills that ended with something working that hadn't worked that morning. Luke turned the pages slowly. Danny had even included a rough training schedule. At the bottom of one page was a handwritten note. "Walter, Luke would know how to build this better than I do. Don't tell him I said that." Dr. Luke read it once, then again. A sound escaped him. Half laugh, half breath. "Idiot." Koda raised his head. Luke sat down on the workshop floor. Mara didn't move. The paper remained in Luke's hand. For 2 years, he had carried Danny as a collection of unfinished memories. The phone call he hadn't answered, the deployment, the mountain accident. Things Luke should have noticed. Things he should have said. Now Danny had reached forward through a box beneath Walter's workshop and handed him something Luke had never expected. A future. Not instructions. Not forgiveness. Work. Luke's face folded before he could stop it. He lowered his head. The first sob came quietly, then another. He didn't turn away, didn't stand up, didn't apologize. Koda struggled to his feet. His healing shoulder made the first steps awkward. "Stay," Luke managed. Koda ignored him. He crossed the concrete slowly. One step, another. His rear leg dragged slightly when he was tired now. Luke watched him come. Stubborn old man. Koda reached him and lowered himself with a grunt. His head settled across Luke's leg. Luke put one hand on the dog's neck. He cried for Danny, for Walter, for the men they had been overseas, and the men who had come home carrying things nobody else could see. For the nights, Danny had apparently slept in his truck outside this workshop because 4 walls were too much. For the nights, Luke had done almost the same thing without knowing his friend understood. And finally, for the simple fact that Danny had imagined Luke surviving long enough to build something. Mara quietly walked into Walter's office and closed the door behind her. Luke stayed on the floor. After a while, the tears stopped. Koda remained. Luke picked up Danny's proposal. The millions downstairs suddenly seemed smaller than the pages in his hand. Walter had left him ownership. Danny had left him purpose. There was a difference. Luke looked around the old machine shop. He could almost see it. Workbenches restored. Veterans learning trades. Search teams bringing in damaged gear before winter. Coffee burning somewhere. Radios charging. People with nowhere useful to be at 8 in the morning having somewhere useful to be at 8 in the morning. Koda lifted his muzzle. Luke scratched beneath his chin. What do you think? The dog's tail struck the floor once. Luke nodded. Yeah. He looked toward the hidden wall. For months, everyone had been fighting over what Walter had concealed beneath the workshop. Scott thought the secret was worth millions. He had been right. He had also been completely wrong. Because the most valuable thing Luke found in Walter Mercer's workshop wasn't buried beneath concrete. It was Danny's unfinished plan sitting in his hands. And this time, Luke intended to finish what his friend had started. 1 year later, snow came early to Timber Hollow. By sunrise, Black Pine Road had disappeared beneath 6 inches of white. The old workshop had not. Warm light glowed through windows that had once been cracked and gray with dirt. Smoke rose from a new chimney. Trucks lined the cleared gravel beside the building, most of them old enough to carry dents without embarrassment. Above the main entrance hung a simple wooden sign. Black Pine Veterans and Rescue Works. Luke had argued against putting his name anywhere. Walter's wasn't on the sign either. Danny's wasn't. The place wasn't supposed to become a monument. It was supposed to work. Inside, it did. A drill press hummed near the rear wall. Someone was rebuilding a snowmobile suspension on a hydraulic table. 2 benches over, a former Marine named Ben was learning how to repair a portable rescue winch under Hank Dalton's supervision. "Measure it again," Hank said. "I measured it twice. Then you'll be real confident about the third one." Ben stared at him. Hank stared back. Luke walked past carrying coffee. "Don't involve me." "Coward," Ben muttered. "Survivor." Someone laughed. The sound followed Luke across the shop. A year earlier, silence had lived in this building. Now there were radios charging beside the office, gloves drying above the stove, coffee cups with names written on them, tool drawers opening and closing. People came from volunteer rescue teams across western Montana with equipment they couldn't afford to replace. Sometimes Black Pine repaired it for cost, sometimes for nothing. Luke had used only part of Walter's recovered inheritance to establish the operation. Mara had insisted on accountants, insurance, a board, written policies, and several other things Luke described collectively as paperwork designed to prevent me from doing something dumb. She had not disagreed. The rest remained professionally managed while the old ownership issues finished working through the legal system. Scott's case had moved more slowly. Luke rarely asked about it anymore. Caldwell called when something required his attention. Mara handled what she could. Luke testified when necessary. Then he came back to Timber Hollow. That was enough. At 8:17 every morning, Koda made his inspection. Nobody had taught him the routine. Front door, equipment bay, office, stove, rear wall. Then the old shepherd lowered himself onto a thick mat where he could watch most of the room. He was 8 now. The gray around his muzzle had spread. The scar from the wire remained visible above his rear paw, a narrow line where the fur grew differently. On his shoulder, pale hair covered the place where the metal bar had split the skin. Cold mornings made him stiff. Luke had built a shallow ramp beside the 2 steps at the office. Koda refused to use it for 3 weeks. Then one morning, when nobody appeared to be watching, he used it. Luke said nothing. Some victories didn't need witnesses. His own nights were less predictable. There were still times when Luke woke before he understood why. A snowplow striking its blade against frozen gravel could put him upright in darkness with his heart pounding. A dropped steel plate once sent him behind a workbench before he realized where he was. Nobody laughed. That mattered. Some nights he walked into the workshop at 2 in the morning and found another veteran already there drinking coffee. They didn't always talk. That mattered too. Luke had stopped measuring recovery by whether the old reactions disappeared. He measured it differently now. How long before he recognized where he was? Whether he could go back to sleep? Whether he called someone instead of sitting alone until sunrise? Small things. Visible endings. Like Walter's repairs. The hidden wall remained open. Luke had refused every suggestion to close it. The concealed shelving had been secured permanently to one side, leaving the entrance exposed. Walter's tools remained inside. So did the maps. Danny's red and black harness hung where Luke had first found it. Beside it were photographs of volunteer rescue crews, Walter at his machines, Danny sitting at the workbench, and Koda in younger years with both ears high. The lower hatch stayed locked now. There was nothing mysterious beneath it anymore. The important records had been moved to secure storage, but the wall stayed open. A small plaque hung beside the entrance. Some things don't need replacing. They need someone willing to stay long enough to repair them. Walter Mercer. Late that afternoon, the snow thickened. Most of the crew had gone home before the road worsened. Luke remained with 3 others, finishing equipment requested by a volunteer rescue team farther north. A young veteran named Tyler was rebuilding a damaged gear housing at Walter's old bench. He had been at Black Pine 4 months. For the first 2, he barely spoke. Luke never asked why. One day, Tyler began arriving early. Then he started making coffee. A month later, he complained about other people not putting tools back where they belonged. Luke considered that progress. Tyler wiped his hands on a rag and looked toward the open wall. "Can I ask you something?" "You just did." Tyler waited. Luke sighed. "Go ahead. How'd you find that room?" Luke glanced toward the opening. Walter's tools, Danny's harness, photographs, a place that had once existed only as cold air moving through a crack. Luke looked across the workshop. Koda was asleep beside the stove. As if sensing his name without hearing it, the shepherd opened one eye. Luke nodded toward him. "I didn't." Tyler followed his gaze. "He did." The younger man smiled. "Figures." He returned to the gear housing. Luke took his coffee outside. Snow came down quietly now. The mountains were gone behind it. Black Pine Road had become a pale ribbon between dark trees. Luke stood beneath the overhang and listened. A year ago, weather like this had made the property feel cut off from the world. Tonight, the workshop behind him was warm. A rescue radio murmured from the bench. Someone inside laughed at something Hank had said. Metal tapped against metal. Luke's shoulders tightened at the sharp sound. Just once, then released. He took another drink. The coffee was terrible. That meant Hank had made it. Luke went back inside. Koda was standing. "Where are you going?" The dog stretched carefully, then began his slow walk across the concrete, past the machines, past Walter's workbench, toward the hidden wall. Luke watched him. For years, Koda had remembered this place. Danny walking these floors. Walter's voice, the old harness. The room behind the wall. the secret beneath the floor. Maybe smells remained that no human being could detect. Maybe memory worked differently for dogs. Luke would never know. Koda reached the opening. He stopped. Luke waited. No scratching. No sniffing at the floor. No tilted head. The shepherd simply looked into the room. For one quiet second, he stood beneath Danny's old harness. Then he turned around. He walked back across the workshop, slowly, past Tyler, past the stove, straight to Luke. Koda lowered himself onto the floor and rested against Luke's boots. Luke looked down. Nothing? The tail moved once. Luke smiled. Good. He placed his hand between the dog's ears. Outside, snow covered the tire tracks on Black Pine Road. Inside, the lights stayed warm. A repaired rescue winch turned smoothly on the test stand. Someone marked tomorrow's work on a whiteboard. A radio voice reported worsening conditions near a mountain pass, and 2 volunteers began quietly checking equipment in case a call came. Life moved through the workshop without asking permission from the past. Walter had left a door. Danny had left a plan. Koda had remembered the way, and Luke had stayed long enough to build something on the other side. The dog had spent years remembering the place Danny left behind. Now there was finally nothing left for him to find. If Koda's loyalty touched you, leave a simple one in the comments. And if you believe some things, and some people, are worth staying for, subscribe and join us for the next story. There are still more roads to travel, more secrets waiting behind forgotten doors, and more stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances waiting for you here. Until the next one, take care of yourself, and never forget the ones who stayed beside you when the road got hard.